Meaningful symbolic communication is our ability to connect meaning with symbols, as the name suggests. Meaningful communication can be language, it can be sign language, it can be using pictorial boards, etc. The thing to remember, though, is not necessarily just the definition of it, but how we get there, the progression of other forms of communication that leads us to higher levels of symbolic communication, like using language. Language is a higher level of communication, meaning we have to learn the precursors first. I stress this because so many children who have language challenges and delays did not master the preverbal forms of communication, the gestural communicative patterns that we talk about in the fourth milestone. The continuous flow requires children using many steps of looking and smiling and nodding and pointing and pushing and pulling and grabbing in long patterns and sequences. It is this use of our gestural and motor system to communicate that allows us to gain access to language. However, it also helps us connect meaning to the process. So when I start trying to achieve a goal, when I take you by the hand and lead you over to the door, and I even say open, now there is a real purpose and meaning behind what I'm saying, which makes it communication, not just words. However, if we teach children specific signs, if we teach them to memorize words or pictures, while it does achieve the goal of getting them to sometimes use some of those, rarely do we see them functionally using all of them, and we often end up with kids who use 10, 15, 20 of the words or signs for everything, and they don't use the other hundreds or thousands of them. But nonetheless, the reason for that is because we're actually skipping over necessary developmental stages. When a child is developing their motor system, there's an old adage, you have to walk before you run, right? And it's true. From a motor and a physical development standpoint, you have to learn to walk before you run. But actually, from a neurological standpoint, you're also supposed to learn to crawl before you walk. Now, some kids jump right up and start walking, but actually kids who do that tend to have a higher frequency of learning challenges because they're actually not going through the correct developmental stages of motor development that require them to perform certain activities that actually wire the brain in ways that allow us to move higher and higher up throughout our lives. The same is true with communication. We all focus on language because it tends to be the most obvious symptom of so many challenges that children experience. However, rarely do we often see pure language disorders. They do exist, but oftentimes we're seeing communication disorders, meaning that children are not just not acquiring language, but they're struggling to communicate in general. And children need 20 to 30 steps of nonverbal communication interactions and patterns before they're able to really graduate and move up to the use of language. You may see little bits of language during that process, but nonetheless, we have to work towards language by mastering the previous and preverbal communication strategies, which help us connect meaning to words. Now you see the word meaning in this title because it's meaningful symbolic communication. That means we're not talking about memorizing colors, letters, numbers, and shapes that we can simply point at in a flashcard or a book. Those are not meaningful. Yes, they eventually can have meaning, but again, if I memorize the number 2, do I really understand that that number 2 can apply to 2 people, 2 cookies, $2, 2 toys, whatever it might be? It's a symbolic unit of measurement that applies and gives meaning to a lot of different things. So, if we don't have a sense that language and meaning need to be connected, we then don't develop language for purposes of communication. It's also important to understand here that pretend play and fantasy-based play emerges around the same time as language because they are both forms of symbolic communication. A child creating a story, even if it doesn't involve a lot of language, but acting it out, is still a symbolic representation of something that's not real.